else. As I stated before, I am tired, so I will do my best to retain some semblance of coherence tonight. If you'd pray for that for me, that we can maintain focus and get through this, I would greatly appreciate it if you guys would help me out with that, because rabbit trails are going to be truly enticing to me tonight. So let's go ahead and open up in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you again for bringing us together tonight. Lord, I pray just in opening, I know I normally only list requests at the end, God, but I pray tonight that you would help my mind to be clear and focused on what you've shown to me through your word, that I would be able to translate that and convey that to everyone here in a way that is pleasing, glorifying to you, God, and helps us to understand and uh, and be true to what you ask of us, God. Uh, uh, so, Lord, we pray that tonight our hearts would be receptive, and God, that your word would speak to us on a very personal level. And I pray all this in your name. Amen. All right. So, what happened last week, guys? What did we talk about in the opening of Nehemiah? Oh, let's start off. Who wrote Nehemiah? Who wrote the book? Just to make sure that we've got the review down. Correct. Nehemiah, that basically kind of took a little section of his life and wrote an autobiography on it of sorts. So yes, Nehemiah. When does this happen? We just finished the book of Ezra. Where in regards to the book of Ezra does Nehemiah happen? You guys remember that? About 15 to 20 years, Kess. Most scholars tend to agree in that range, around 20 years difference between the end of Ezra and when this whole thing starts with Nehemiah. All right. What were some themes that we talked about in the book of Nehemiah? Bob's got one. Mourning, repentance, hope. Those are some things that we saw in chapter 1. If we were to take, we mentioned some greater themes that run throughout the book. One was when we talk about Ezra, we talk about the spiritual awakening, the spiritual reestablishment of the people in the land of Palestine, uh, the return of the children of captivity, and then their spiritual um, uh, refounding, if you will. Um, while Ezra deals more on a spiritual level, Nehemiah is based less on a spiritual level and more on the establishment of an actual civilization. It's more physical. It's creating an actual physical home for the people in the building of the wall of Jerusalem. We also talked about leadership and how Nehemiah is a study in the leadership qualities and the actions of a man who stands forth as a leader, as we see in Nehemiah. Another one that I didn't really touch on much is the idea of prayer. We'll see that a little bit tonight, but Nehemiah is a man that runs to prayer very quickly. And you can qualify that under leadership, but we'll start to see that tonight. Nehemiah running whenever he's faced with something, either a trial or a crisis or what have you, he doesn't hesitate at all. He's like, you'll see it a number of times through the book. It's like the Bible will make a statement about something, and it says in Nehemiah, right, and I prayed. It's just there it is. So that happens a number of times. It is a great characteristic in the leader. It's true. All right. So, with all of that being said, actually, are there any questions so far? I want everybody caught up so that we know. We didn't actually go over what happened last week. I'm sorry. Um, so, what happened in Nehemiah 1? Yep, got some bad news from home. Nehemiah asks his this brother of his, Hanani. He says, "How are things in Judah?" And Hanani's like, "Well, it's not good. The people live in shame because there's no wall around the Jerusalem. It's been destroyed, and the gates are burned with fire, and so people live there, but it's not a good situation." So what does Nehemiah do in response? He mourns for days. That's true. He does something else. What else does he do? Yeah, he prays, and he prays quite a bit actually. And we talked about that kind of like right at the end. We mentioned that Nehemiah starts in the month of Chislev, or Chislev, I guess would be the correct pronunciation. And then chapter 2 starts in the month of Nisan, which is 4 months later. So we know that there's this 4 month time span where Nehemiah is spending in prayer, and that's important. We'll get into that a little bit more. Um, and then chapter 1 ends on a very important note because it describes Nehemiah, what he does. What is Nehemiah? What's his job? Yeah, the cupbearer for who? Yes, the king. Excellent. Not Xerxes, Artaxerxes. Yep. All right. So that sets the stage for chapter 2. So, with that being said, can I get someone to take the first 2 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2? Elissa can read it if she wants. No, don't do that. That would be just tremendously distracting.
I can take it.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid.
Thank you. All right. So, just a little bit more stage setting. So, we know this is 4 months after he originally gets this bad news. So, we see that in this instance, Nehemiah is doing his job. We talked about last week how it uh, the king would have not just one cupbearer but many. So this is an instance where Nehemiah, basically gets the call. It's like, hey, it's your turn to go be the cupbearer, and he's like, okay. So he goes and he takes the wine and he does his thing. He tastes it and obviously doesn't keel over from poison, so we're good. And he gives it to the king. And Nehemiah states that he hadn't been sad before in the presence of the king. So remember, he's been dealing with this bad news for 4 months, and yet he's managed to conceal it for this long. And it's now, after 4 months, that the king notices. So, my first question, do you think this was intentional on the part of Nehemiah? I have my King James Version right here, Kess. It says, "Now I had not been before time sad in his presence." That's what the King James says. I get that, Wise Rat. I said, do you think that the fact that the king notices for the first time in 4 months that Nehemiah's sad, do you think that was intentional? Okay. I'm not going to answer that on Nehemiah's part. I'm going to let that linger. I'm not going to give my answer yet because I think the next couple verses can give a little insight to that. But there is something else we need to touch on first. At the end in verse 2, the king notices Nehemiah is not looking like himself. And he says, "Why is your face sad? You're not sick, obviously." He says, "This is nothing but sadness of the heart." And it says that Nehemiah was very much afraid. Why would he be afraid? So he's sad. So what? I'm happy king, happy life. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're unhappy in the king's presence, literally it was a crime to be unhappy in the king's presence in Persian culture. So that might be part of the reason why Nehemiah hadn't been sad in his presence before, because he's like, hey, I'm not a real big fan of losing my head. I'm rather fond of everything above my shoulders. So that could be part of it. But yeah, you guys you absolutely nailed that. That's a very legitimate reason to be afraid. All right. Any questions so far? Interesting pickup, Kess. Historically, Artaxerxes was regarded as a bit of a weak king, not strong-handed like Darius or certain of his predecessors had been. But he tended to be a bit more sympathetic in his rule, and you can kind of see that here in the way in which he is just in this introduction to him in regards to Nehemiah. He looks at his cupbearer, a man who he'd naturally be close to. The king is often entrusting his life to this man, and he sees him on probably at least a fairly regular basis as one of his cupbearers, and so it's not unreasonable to believe that that the king and Nehemiah, his cupbearer, would have some sort of more than more than a formal relationship, just because of the nature of how they interact with each other. Rapport, it's a good word. Yeah, good pickup. But yeah, Artaxerxes is regarded as kind of a more a gentler king, a gentler among the kings of Persia. Good pickup. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Nothing there. All right. How about the next two verses? Verses 3 and 4. Okay. It's only 2 verses. No tough names.
I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Then the king said to me, What are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven.
Thank you. So Nehemiah instantly, the king's like, hey, you look upset. And Nehemiah's like, well, I'm sweating bullets. So he responds in what would be a traditional greeting to the king or to the emperor, or however you would refer to them in that time. He'd say, "Let the king live forever." That's not something that's unique to Nehemiah. Certain other Old Testament passages, Daniel says that quite a bit in regards. He says it to both Nebuchadnezzar, and he also says it to Darius. Throughout his reign. So a number of things. Darius, Cyrus, something. Yeah. So that's not an uncommon phrase. That's Nehemiah just saying, okay, this is how you start a sentence when talking to the king. You say, "O king, live forever." And he says, "Why shouldn't my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" So Nehemiah kind of plays this little interesting game with the king. He says, okay, you caught me. I'm not real happy. And he gives him this reason. He says, the place of my fathers lies in ruins. Its walls are broken down. The gates are torched. It's not good. And I'm thinking of my people, and it's not a good situation there. Now, we talked a little bit last week, and Kess actually beat me to the punch on it because she reads my notes. Have we talked about what tribe Nehemiah is from? Right. It doesn't say. The Bible doesn't tell us. But there are hints that lead us to be able to make certain suppositions. And this is one of those things that that the people that tend to think that he's from Judah would state, because he says the place of my father's graves. Now, Jerusalem, doesn't is kind of a smorgasbord of different tribes, obviously because it was the center of worship and such, primarily of the southern tribes. But the most notable individuals that would have been buried in the capital city of a kingdom would have been the royal family, which was from the tribe of Judah. Just drop that there. So, just helping to understand one side of an argument. But he says, and also on a side point, that's Nehemiah is kind of playing to even further to the king's sympathies with this. To the Persians, the ability to control an area or to be able to honor an area where your forefathers were buried was important. The Persians were one of the early societies that made graves for their ancestors, and so to be able to say that the place where my fathers are buried is in ruins would have kind of tugged a little more at the heartstrings of an already sympathetic king. And then the king asks this really interesting question. He says, "What are you requesting?" Why would he ask that? Because that is a question that is made that assumes a lot. Yeah. He's like, okay, so I hear that you have this dilemma, but I sense that it's not just this idea of, oh, I'm sad. You're wanting something to be done about it. Now, let's go back to verses 1 and 2. I asked, do you think that Nehemiah intentionally showed his cards, let his emotions loose a little on purpose? And we didn't quite answer that. I'm going to expand that question here based upon the next phrase. Nehemiah, it says that Nehemiah, so he prayed to the God of heaven. Here's the question as I think it needs to be asked. Did Nehemiah show his emotions a little more? Or would you think he was looking for a sign? I think Eli's a little is on the right track. Because remember, Nehemiah has spent 4 months praying about this. And it comes to this day, the king calls him out on what he sees. And then Nehemiah makes this statement and says, well, my home where my fathers are buried lies in ruins. And he gets this question from the king, not this question of, like your point. He asks, what do you want? What is your request? It's almost like inviting Nehemiah to talk more, to explain what he has in mind. I believe that this is, it's a very Eastern conversation where the listener is doing all the work. I believe that this was something that Nehemiah had prayed about. He kind of feels like Gideon a little bit, asking for a sign. Hey, God, let me throw out this fleece. Nehemiah is kind of waiting. He's looking for an invitation to present what he feels led to do. And the king calls him out, and first thought is, oh man, I'm about to lose my head. But then instead of that happening, it goes the exact opposite direction. Artaxerxes says, what are you asking of me? And I think that's a very clear cut. The way in which this is written makes this clear claim, because up to this point Nehemiah has been in this one-on-one conversation with the king of Persia, but with this one sentence, then I prayed to the God of heaven, it's this recognition. Now we don't know what Nehemiah prayed, it doesn't tell us. There's this switch where Nehemiah defers to the king for maybe just a split second and goes to a higher power. And I think that's an indication that Nehemiah is looking and saying, God, I think this is a sign that I am to pursue what I've been praying about for the past 4 months. Yeah. That's a good way of looking at it. Kiss, Gideon, let me throw out this fleece. Nehemiah, let me toss out my neck. But yes. And so you've got this point where Nehemiah is like, okay, God, I feel like you've given me the green light to go ahead. So let me explain to Artaxerxes what you've laid on my heart to do. All right? So that's where we're at. Any questions? Eli is typing. I shall wait. Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. Basically, the cupbearer was actually kind of a high-ranking position, actually, as an official. He would taste the king's food to make sure it wasn't poison. If Nehemiah died, then the king was like, I don't think I want to eat that. Yeah, Kess, very much so. This is, and something that needs to be said is that, remember, this entire moment was bathed in 4 months worth of prayer. This entire moment was led up to in prayer. Nehemiah just pursuing, praying, asking God, like, God, what is your plan? What would you have me do about this? Because Nehemiah had a burden, and God led Nehemiah to this point. And Nehemiah recognized that, and after the king asked, what are you requesting of me? He prays instantaneously, which is a thing that happens quite a bit. We'll see that further in the book. All right. How about the next 4 verses, verses 5 through 8? All right, Wise Rat, go ahead, sir. Okay.
And I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, then you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, and the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber and to make beams for the gates of the fortresses of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me.
Awesome sauce. Thank you, sir. All right. Let's... I know that at least one of you is probably chomping at the bit, so let's get the question out of the way. Verse 6. And the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him. All right. So I want to know, with a yay or a nay, who thinks this is Queen Esther? Who thinks this is not Queen Esther? Bob thinks it's Esther. Which are this is Artaxerxes the First. It wasn't actually the name listed in the Bible isn't Artaxerxes, it's Ahasuerus. That's the name given in the Bible. All right, so we have 2 yeses, 1 for Bob, 1 for Kess. Wise Rat says no. Ooh, there is dissension in the camp. And Kess has a point there. It's hard for archaeologists to find lists that really agree with each other. There are generally some that do correspond well. A list of kings that we do have that's generally received as a pretty solid consensus of the order of the kings. But there's some names that appear, and you're just like, that didn't fit real well. So there's some confusion. All right, so I've got 2 yeses and 1 no, and the rest of you are too scared to answer. All right, got it. So after doing some research, it seems like the vast majority of scholars would say that no, this is not Esther. Most place, because of the timing of it, most place the story of Esther happening about 20, 25 years, sometimes 30 years earlier than the beginning of the story of Nehemiah. And remember, we are in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which means that this was happening, up to possibly 10 years prior to this guy even becoming king. So it doesn't look like it. Now, that being said, why would that statement be there then? Why threat? He's like, that's a good point. All right, so let's give some cultural context here. And we're actually going to use Esther a little bit here. Because if we go over, the story of Esther starts with the king actually kind of being at this party, right? Where he asks, he's got a party for all of his friends, and he asks the queen to come out and dance, and he's like, nah, fam, ain't gonna do that. And based upon that and a number of other historical and archaeological evidence, whenever the queen was present with the king, it was a private affair. In a public event, the queen wasn't present. She would be aside in another chamber. So with the queen being right beside the king, we can tell that this is a private event that's happening, which lends itself to Nehemiah asking at this point, because he's not having to contend with the interference or the pressure of a crowd. It's just he and the royal family. Now, there are some that have posed whether or not Esther may be familial relationship, like either the queen or possibly the king would have been her, either like her niece or nephew or something, and maybe she played into this. That maybe Esther had some role in the fact that Artaxerxes was such a compassionate king. It's difficult to say. These are all just kind of suppositions. We don't know. But what we do know for sure is that this is a very clear indication that this is a private event. In case you're wondering who this queen was, more than likely, it is actually who would the head consort or the head of the harem of the king, a lady by the name of Damaspia or Damaspia. I'll put it in chat. That's who this is likely referring to. That's the name of the queen as it appears in historical records. Fun fact about her: she actually died the same day as King Artaxerxes. That's really the sum total of everything we know about her. So there you go. That's the best way to go. All right. So now that we've got that, let's take a step back. We got that one. So Nehemiah says, look, if it pleases the king, if this seems like a good idea to you, and if I've been good to you to the point that you trust me to undertake a task or undertake this task, send me to Judah. Now, notice that Nehemiah to this point has chosen his words very carefully. Has he named the city that he's going to? Nope. There has been no mention of a city by the name of Jerusalem at this point. Why would Nehemiah do that? Why wouldn't he name the city? Interesting question. Not one I came across. It's probably likely that he knew, but I can't say that I know for sure. Interesting thought, Wise Rat. Possibly, Bob. I mean, yeah, but that would be the case with any city, not necessarily Jerusalem. He says straight up, it's like, I'd like to fix this problem, but yes, the fact that it would be the capital city would be probably a little bit more of a problem. Also, let's not forget that back in Ezra, there were certain things that happened. Basically, the Samaritans interfering and accusing the Jews in Jerusalem of starting an uprising, even though it wasn't true. So we have kind of this existence of possibly a little bit of thoughts in the mind of the king, like, oh, I've heard of bad things about this. Do I really want this city getting fortified? So, especially when it's it was a former capital of the nation. So there's probably a few things playing at play here, and Nehemiah is being very diplomatic about his choice of words. And so the king kind of like taps his chin and he says, all right, how long will you be gone? And Nehemiah gives him a time. Doesn't tell us how long. We have no idea how long Nehemiah said he'd be gone. But apparently the king was like, all right, that's fine. And look at how this has progressed. Nehemiah is basically the food tester for the king. He goes in one day, the king looks at him and says, you seem sad in my presence. And normally that's a crime, but I think I'm going to be a little bit more concerned about this because I feel like there may be something bigger at play. Are you okay? And Nehemiah says, well, my city is basically ransacked. And that makes me sad. And the king says, well, what do you want me to, what are you asking me? And Nehemiah says, well, I'd like to go back and rebuild the walls. And so the king's like, okay. Does that seem at all a little extreme to you? Like, that in and of itself, you just told a story like that, you're just like, wait, what? That was rapid. There might have been something in that wine. Maybe Nehemiah didn't tell the king. It was like, well, there's not poison, but there might be something in there. No. Verse 8 is really pivotal. He says, the king granted me what I asked, including some other things we'll touch on real quick. For the good hand of my God was upon me. And Nehemiah never fails to recognize the hand of God in his actions. Everything that happens, he's like, the good hand of God is with me. He always does that. And it's really cool to see. He always recognizes that, yes, the king is instrumental in allowing him to go back and granting him the supplies that he needs and all this stuff. But he says that only happened because God was good and gracious and let it happen. He orchestrated it all. Very similar to Ezra in that regard. So before we finish off this passage, let's see some of the stuff that Ezra asks. Or there it is, 5 cents in the jar. Nehemiah asks. He says, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river. What river are we talking about? The Euphrates, exactly. That they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. Now the question was raised in some of the commentaries, why didn't he ask for letters for passage before he got to the Euphrates? It's a fair question. Chances are that was still close enough and under such direct control of the Central Persian core, such as it was, that he wouldn't need it. But once he passed beyond into kind of the more, the outer reaches of the empire, then having an official document from the king would go a long way, because news would not travel or wouldn't probably beat him there. He would probably have to travel with a document just as certification. He says, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the temple and for the wall and in my own house. Where was the king's forest? Any idea? Any thoughts? Sure would. Correct. I find it difficult to argue with that logic. He does control Lebanon at this point. Cass is still typing, so I will wait until she finishes. Maybe it's a forest in the mountains where it's not so dry. Why is that? So cedars of Lebanon makes sense. All right. So I kind of misled you a little bit because, again, this is English. In the original language, the word is forest, but it doesn't carry the idea of a large forest. It's more of an idea of a park or a specified area that has trees growing in it, but it's not just like a natural forest. Besides, going to Lebanon to get trees like cedar trees for a wall is kind of extreme, because cedar trees are really nice furbished trees. They're meant to be for kind of aesthetics and such. If you're just building a wall, who cares about how the wall looks? The wall's not meant to look pretty, it's meant to keep people out. So what this is more than likely referring to is a specific area, a forested area not too far from Jerusalem, that's under the care of Persia in case they need timber within that region. And this Asaph guy, Asaph is a Jewish name. So more than likely, this is a guy who has been put in charge of overseeing this, I call it like a natural park, for Persia, for if they would ever require it in the area, like now. Does that make sense? All right. Awesome sauce. Any questions before we move on? Oh, I'm taking up all kinds of time. We're gonna have to blitz. All right. We're only in verse what, 9? Genius. And it's like 10 till. Woo! All right, let's go ahead and do verses. This is more than I wanted to do at once, but we'll tackle it. Let's actually have someone take the first 2 verses there, and then we'll have someone take the verses 11 through 16. Okay, go ahead, Eli.
Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel.
All right, thank you. So here we have introduced some of the villains of our story. This guy named Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant. Now, Sanballat's name actually appears in certain archaeological records And he was basically referred to as a satrap over the Sumerian region. And Tobiah was probably an officer of his or someone working closely with him. And so when they hear that Jerusalem's going to be, kind of, or hear that he's going to Jerusalem for some work, he doesn't quite tell what's up, but he's going to Jerusalem for some work. They get discouraged. Why would they get discouraged? Why would they be upset that Jerusalem's being rebuilt or that something's happening in Jerusalem? Ammonite and Horonite? Yeah, that could have something to do with it. These guys were the Ammonites and the Horonites. The Horonite is they're like these regions called Beth Horons on either side of Moab. So these guys were likely foreigners who had been displaced and were now in charge of the area where the Samaritans dwell. And the Samaritans, well, they weren't really getting along too well with the Jews. They'd had a couple run-ins. So when they hear that the city of Jerusalem would be receiving some kind of aid, that was likely to detract from the influence and power of Samaria in the region. So they were like, that's not good. That would put the Jews on the rise and us kind of on the fall, and we're not about that. Okay? So these guys will come up a few times. So just kind of keep them in mind. We'll see them again quite a bit, actually. All right. How about verses 11 through 16? Go ahead, Wise Rat.
So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and sorry, my screen moved.
Yep.
And I told no one about my God and put it into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work.
All right. Thank you. So, real quick, I was going to go through this in a little bit more depth, but seeing as how I'm really short on time, I'm not going to go through it. Basically, Nehemiah decides, hey, listen, I'm going to take a couple guys, just some really close, trusted guys, and we're going to go out at night. That's important, to go inspect the walls and just kind of see what the condition of these things is. And so he goes out through the valley gate, which you kind of see down on the southwest corner, if you're looking at the map, and he just kind of goes counterclockwise around the city, looking at the walls. Just a couple things to note. On the south side of the city, you see this Valley of Hinnom, often referred to as Gehenna. That is a term. That's the term used by Jesus in the New Testament whenever he talks about hell. That's the word Gehenna. It was a valley that was used as the refuse dump for the city of Jerusalem. So the waste and everything from the city would generally be taken out of the dung gate down on the southeast corner, down into and dumped into the Valley of Hinnom, and where it would be lit on fire to be destroyed. That was the picture of hell that Jesus drew. It was very unpleasant. Drew a really good picture. And then it says that Nehemiah goes up the valley, or by the stream, which would be the Kidron Valley on the eastern side. Things got a little rough, so he had to go on foot for a ways, and then he comes around the full counterclockwise back to the valley gate. And it says he doesn't tell anyone. He doesn't tell the Jews. He doesn't tell the nobles, the princes, the priests, the officials. Nobody knows what he's been up to. Why would he do all of this in secret? Yep. He's already met a couple guys that are not real keen on him doing whatever he's planning on doing in Jerusalem. We know he's going there for some kind of work, but they don't know what it is. And Nehemiah doesn't want to give them a chance to counter it. So he's playing things very close to his chest. He goes out to inspect the walls by night. He doesn't tell anyone. And he goes out to inspect the walls because he wants to make a plan. And he doesn't want anything getting spoiled until he's got it. And so as he's inspecting, he's like, okay, I see the parts that we really need to focus on. I see what we need to get done here, 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 here. And so as he's thinking and getting everything together, he's like, I don't want this getting out so that our enemies can come against us and halt the work that we're planning. I want this all to come out very quickly so that we can get started before they have a chance to oppose us in any kind of force. All right. Any questions before we close out or finish this off? No, you guys on board? Awesome. All right. Now, I haven't. Nehemiah is very shrewd. He's actually really clever. And if you just think about him as this cupbearer, you wouldn't think that of him. But he's actually a lot more clever and a lot more shrewd. I guess that would be the best term. Than you'd expect. He was, the cupbearer was seen as kind of an official within the court of Persia. So he wasn't just this dude that came out, like dipped his finger in the wine and was like, oh, well, that's done. The king would often ask him for advice. So he's had a little bit of experience with this. Now, I haven't read anything tonight, so I'll go ahead and take verses 17 through 20. So Nehemiah has just finished up his little tour. He says, then I said to them, meaning all those guys that he didn't tell anything to, he says, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Okay. So, fun question. How much time passed between verse 16 and 17? Bob's got it. We have no idea. Some people have said it was the next day. Other people have said it's been days, weeks, possibly even more. We know that Nehemiah, when he came to these guys, he had a plan and that he felt comfortable relaying the plan and kind of prompting everybody get to almost this sense of calling upon national patriotism. Like, hey, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Let's band together. As Jews, we're all brothers in that and fix this wall to establish our place once again as the city of God. I do like those questions. Wise Rat Onger swept off on me. So we really don't know, and it doesn't really matter in the long run, probably. But it's important to note that, the way it reads in English is that you would just assume it was like at dawn the next day, but the Bible doesn't say that. Nehemiah has already been shown as a man that is willing to take his time, and more than likely that's what happened here. He would only go forward when he was good and ready. So he does call on this national pride. He says, look, let's build this wall and reestablish the city of God as it's meant to be here. You guys have the temple, but let's make this an actual city again. And he says, look, God's been doing this great work, and the king has commissioned me to come back and do this. This isn't a thing that we're just like, hey, just out of nowhere, let's do this. The king told me this is good. He has given me permission. He's given me access to resources to get this done. And the Jews are like, that's awesome. That's a sign. Let's get behind this. And it says they strengthened their hands for the good work. Now, why did they have to strengthen their hands? Well, next verse tell us, here are these guys again, Sanballat and Tobiah, and now there's this new guy, Geshem the Arab. These guys were likely all from the area around Samaria, kind of their little triumvirate of naughtiness. That's a fun term. I should get tired more often. Clip that. They all come together and they jeered, and they just start, whether or not they came and were just yelling or came and like in person or they sent a letter. We don't know, but it says they basically said, "What are you guys doing? Are you rebelling? You're building a wall around a capital city. Is this okay?" Notice that Nehemiah doesn't claim or doesn't announce back to them that King Artaxerxes has given them permission for this. He says the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build. Now, this last phrase is very interesting. He says, you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. What is Nehemiah on about here? Well, let me ask it this way. Does this sound familiar at all? Does Nehemiah's response sound like something we may have heard before? Yep, he did. Swing back to Ezra 4, and it says that these adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord. And so they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the father's house, and they said, hey, let us build with you. We've been worshiping God, ever since we've been here. Let us participate. And then Zerubbabel and the rest of these guys say, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. So these Samaritans were wanting a piece of the worship pie, such as it were. And this again plays back into the influence picture. Samaria had been established as a center of religion for those people, and they wanted to assure themselves that they remained as such the center of worship. But Jerusalem now had the temple, and with the construction of a wall to establish an actual city there, it threatened their sphere of influence tremendously. And so they're posing these threats like, listen, are you guys even allowed to do this? And it's like, are you sure you're not just rebelling against the king? You know how that turned out last time you did that, right? And Nehemiah says, look, our God's hand is upon us, and he's going to allow us to prosper, but you don't have any portion or right or claim in what we're doing in Jerusalem. All right? That all making sense? Awesome. Well, I'm only a little bit over time. All right. That is Nehemiah chapter 2. So we've got to introduce some villains. We see that Nehemiah's, his sadness his mourning, his prayer resulted in him coming to Jerusalem, and he's got a plan in the works. So with all of this, what do we take from this week? Nehemiah is on a mission. That's true. Pray about it first. That's super important. And that's going to be a major theme throughout this is the idea of prayer. Recognizing who is in control and recognizing where the first place we should go when we are faced with a crisis. That looks familiar, Kess. A woman foresighted she is. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. And that is not overlooking backwards. Yeah, we've seen God provide. Nehemiah is in Jerusalem, and he's got permission from the king, but the walls are still broken. He's got a plan, but nothing's come of it yet. We're basically in the inspire the people to do something phase. But there's a promise that plays right into Nehemiah. In due season, we will reap if we do not give up. Good stuff. Remember, Nehemiah is a book about leadership. And before he even acted on anything that he wanted to do, his very first action was to pray for 4 months. He took it seriously enough that for 4 months he bathed everything in prayer. And look at how things have come. He made sure that this was what God wanted him to do and that God was behind him before he made a move towards it. Which plays to something that we've talked about a bit recently, being in the center of God's will. And once Nehemiah saw the sign from God, he said, I know where I'm supposed to be, and he moved forward. Also, that's my favorite VeggieTales episode. I love Josh and the Big Wall. Stay focused. We're not done. Anything else, guys? Thoughts, questions? I don't know what that is. I think you're trying to spell this. Nope, not that. That. Yes, I'm tired. Stop teasing me. All right, focus. We're almost done. I'm trying so hard to stay on point. Also, note how Nehemiah was so set on having a plan. He never wanted to move forward until he had a plan. He didn't move impulsively. He moved very deliberately, but he was very patient. I think that's a number of things. Yeah. Intense prayer. That's a good way of putting it. Intense prayer. Then once he was sure that he was where God wanted him to be, he said, what do I have to fear? God's in my corner. Let's go. He didn't hesitate to ask the king. He's like, hey, Your Majesty, could I go to Judah for a bit? And he's like, sure. And then just gradually ask him stuff. He was like, what? The king says, what are you asking of me? And Nehemiah's like, all right. The king just basically opened the door to say, what is it that you want me to do? And he's like, well, here's this plan, this business plan that I've come up with over the last 4 months in talking with my God. What do you think of this? And the king kind of looks it over and says, all right. And Nehemiah says, sweet, let's go. But I like that aggressive action. When we know God's in our corner, what do we have to fear? Yeah. We're here to intimidate you. Shut up. And that's that. There are insects flying around. Go away. That boldness. Nehemiah he really shines in that department. And we'll keep seeing that in coming weeks. All right. Anything else, guys? You're welcome, Rise Rat. Thanks for coming. If that's everything, guys, we'll go ahead and take prayer requests so we can close out. Have a good night, Ms. Wise Rat. Thank you for coming.